I'm almost a little surprised that we're still talking about change as a constant. I feel like I was talking about this like 10 or 15 years
Totally,
ago, and
right?
we're still talking
Yeah.
about change being a constant.
A lot of what you talk about seems to be around this theme of like getting outside those boundaries or the realm of what you know and kind of getting into and exploring what you don't know.
I try and recenter them in their agency. They have agency in situations. They
Yeah.
have the choice to act. I had a really fantastic leader early on in my career that showed me, I think, what great leaders are supposed to do. Make you feel included, make you feel seen, make you feel like your voice is heard. Personally, I expect change, right? And quite frankly, I kind of like change. It keeps things interesting. Life doesn't get boring if there's a lot of change going on. So I talked about that idea of the bounds of your ignorance. They help illuminate that, right? Because sometimes it's hard to know what you don't know, and assessments can be an instrument.
Just
to
shines a
help you
light
find
in that corner of the room, and you're like, oh.
Oh, that's the thing, right? I think it's one way that's really going to change the game for assessments too, because
I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
Rebecca, welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
I've really been enjoying these live experiences. This is a totally different way to have. It's like a legitimate conversation, which is awesome. I want to start with your background in organizational psychology.
Yeah.
I'm curious what that study and practice has taught you about your own sort of style as a leader and what you're bringing to your role now.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's been a really fantastic journey because I had the chance to start working before I decided to go into organizational psychology, and I got into the field because I was so curious about the world of work, and I had a really fantastic leader early on in my career that showed me, I think, what great leaders are supposed to do. Make you feel included, make you feel seen, make you feel like your voice is heard. And so, starting out with her as my leader, I just got really drawn into the world of work and how do you design organizations? How do you make this work? And so it's been really, it's been a formative experience for me to go through, my schooling in industrial and organizational psychology and to take those lessons forward into being a leader. And it's really exposed me to a breadth of leaders, right? So I can see and kind of pick and choose my own style and put together who I want to be as a leader.
And we're going to unpack a little bit about that in this conversation. But the role of a mentor like that to kind of ignite something in you, incredible that you had that. What was the thing that was ignited? What was the thing that was there before that always made you interested or curious about this as a topic?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know exactly, but if I think back to even my early life experiences, I've always been very interested in like mobilizing groups of people, right? So I was always that friend or that sister. I'm the oldest of three that was always getting people together to do a thing, and kind of acting as a leader in that sense. So I think part of it is just my natural disposition towards how do you organize people towards a goal? How do you get people swimming in the same direction? And probably efficiency too, right? So I tend to love very efficient processes, and when things aren't very efficient, I notice it really quickly. And that's same about leadership, right? You can notice when leadership isn't working quite right. You can feel it. The tension is sometimes palpable. So like figuring out how do you make it work efficiently and work well, I think has always just been an inner drive for me.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I was definitely the kid who would organize like the talent show, variety show stuff and get all our friends, like presenting to our parents and stuff. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I'm curious because I didn't study this and I've always been interested in and sort of more self-taught in those areas. But when you were going through it as formal education, I guess, what was something that surprised you about the field that really had an impact on you?
Yeah, I think for me, what surprised me was like how data driven it can be, because I think at some level, HR, talent development sometimes gets a bad rap for being the fluffiness in organizations, right? Like you've heard people say that before. Oh, training, it's a nice to have, not a need to have sort of thing.
Yeah.
And when I really got deeper into my industrial and organizational degree, I realized just how much data was there and available, and the methods that you use to then analyze and make decisions off that data. And that was really inspiring to me. I felt, having an evidence-based practice has always been really important. I started out wanting to be a doctor when I was little, and have always been drawn to that evidence-based practice. And so that's what I try and infuse in my daily practice.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to come back to a lot of this because, let's go there now. That data-driven approach, how are you now using that in your role at Udemy?
Yeah, every day. So we're lucky on the learning team at Udemy that we have our people analytics team on the learning team. So we very intentionally brought those two things together. And it's just a fantastic team. I mean, they're brilliant at what they do, and I have such a great respect for that team. So we end up we collaborate quite frequently on our programs. So if we decide to design and build a leadership development program internally, they're one of the first stakeholders that we talk to, right? To say, what are the outcomes or the impact that we're trying to achieve, and then how are we going to be able to measure that? What are the behaviors that we're looking for? How are we going to go about the measurement? And we plan that right from the start before we put pen to paper, so to speak, on any program.
Yeah, that's often something that I find is like the last scrambling thing that teams do, and we've been guilty of this, and our clients as well. Like, we need to, where's our data person? Like, we need to, like, it's an afterthought almost, right? Like, how did you make that an intentional part of your practice there?
I think honestly, my IO degree has really, cemented that in. I have some wonderful professors to thank for that, to make evidence, and data just a part of your practice, right? I think there's a phrase like, if you don't measure it, it didn't happen, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
totally.
I try and channel that in my work.
Yeah. All right. So it's pervasive in everything you do. Yeah. All right. Now, another thing that's intentional, it strikes me about you, and in our first conversation, is the way you've structured your career. Yeah. Can you talk through that journey a little bit?
Yeah, I would say, I would call my career journey like, I've been very intentionally curious, right?
Yeah,
so, those who know me well will say, yeah, she's a curious person, but it's always with an intention behind it, right? Like, she knows what she wants to learn, or she knows what she wants to do. And so I started out earlier in my career. I was working in a hospital setting, leading a very large team, and that's where I really discovered leadership and just love the idea of how do you lead a team, how you develop a team. But I knew that I was really lacking on experience.
Okay. And that was from just doing it, being like put into that position.
Yeah, being a leader. I was thrown into it very early on. So I was still in my undergrad, and I took an internship right at a hospital for in Baltimore, Maryland, and I got. I was there for less than a year, and then got thrown into a team lead position. And it was like being thrown to the sharks, right? Like, I just had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was very young in experience, young in age. I was very green overall. Yeah. And I just had some really fantastic lessons there, right? Like, I made a ton of mistakes as a leader. I was not a great leader in that role at all. Yeah. But I became very fascinated by, like, well, how do you lead people in a way that, they're doing what they need to be doing, right, for the business. They're delivering business outcomes. And, you're not hated, right? You're like, somewhat like they like you. They want to work for you,
exactly.
That sort of thing. You're building a followership.
Right.
And so I found myself being really fascinated with that. So I knew that I needed to get out and get experience. And everyone had been telling me, like, consulting helps get you tons of experience early on. And so I started working for a little firm in the UK called Kaizen Consulting, which was a team of business psychologists. It was a really fantastic place to work. And I got trained in doing in-depth leadership assessment and development work. So I was, working with very senior executives, really understanding them from a person level, like who are they, how do they think, and how does that drive what they do as leaders?
Yeah.
And then working with them longer term on their development, right? So that might look like a coaching engagement or as part of a cohort in a leadership development experience. And it just really opened my eyes up to the world of leadership development. And I was on a team of like 55 business psychologists, right? So all of these PhDs, master levels.
Oh man, what a great learning
folks,
experience.
It was such an immersive experience,
Yeah.
right? Like you thought you knew something coming out of graduate school,
Yeah.
and then you get put in a room full of 55 other people
Yeah.
that are your specialty, and it just blows your mind,
Yeah.
right? Like it's amazing what
That's
you
awesome.
learn from
What
your
an
peers.
accelerator for your
It accelerates it.
Yeah.
It hugely accelerates it. So we had done some work for Deloitte Consulting with their senior partners, and had kind of gotten on Deloitte's radar, and then we ended up being acquired by Deloitte. So then I got to go through this M&A flow, right? So I learned what the world of mergers and acquisitions looked like as we were acquired by Deloitte Consulting. And we were tasked with starting up the leadership development business there. And so I got, again, the chance to join a small team, based globally, right? So some folks in the US, some folks in the UK. And we started up a leadership consulting business for Deloitte, which was fantastic. You went from this more startup environment to now you have tons of resources and you have this just amazing network of relationships that you're exposed to. And so I was at Deloitte for almost 6 years and just loved my time in consulting. I really met some incredible people, got to do some really cool work. And then I started to, wonder about my customers. I had never been in their seat. I never led L&D. I'd never led leadership development internally at a company. And I knew that I needed that experience if I wanted to get to know my customers on a deeper, more intimate level. I needed to walk in their shoes and learn what they lived with every day.
Yeah.
And so that led me to my next role where I took on, I was hired to lead leadership development, build that function out. So I did that, and then I went on there to lead the learning and development team. And that really taught me, how do you do learning and development internally at an organization,
like
right?
The practical reality of it.
The practical reality of it. And it was a lot different, right? You're having to live with your solutions. You're having to, influence stakeholders to get money to build your solutions,
Navigate priorities.
Advocate for you and your team.
Yeah.
It's a whole different world than when somebody is, paying you for your services.
Yeah.
And you have to deeply understand the business. You have to deeply understand their needs, and then also start to connect that back to, the business strategy and also how you're delivering, value to your shareholders and your customers, because that company was a public company, right? So, we're accountable to the street. So you have to think about that perspective as well. Yeah.
And then from there, you were like, we weren't done yet. There was something else you needed to experience.
Yeah. So I had, the privilege in that role. I had budget. I was, buying products and solutions. I was meeting vendors, right? I was meeting, different vendors and
evaluating them.
Evaluating them, figuring out, a lot of learning around decision making and business judgment, really understanding what you're investing in. And I had never been in the vendor world, right? Apart from consulting as a bit of a vendor, but like a true learning platform or learning solution type vendor.
Yeah.
And I had taken a career break after my time internal to figure out where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And I found Udemy, and I was just really enthralled by their mission, to improve lives through learning. That was something that spoke to me on a very deep personal level. And I loved what they were trying to do. I love that the marketplace model is different than your normal learning platform vendors. We're really unique in that way. It was a very unique value proposition and business model. And I was really attracted to what they were trying to do. And that was a big selling point for me to make the decision to move there.
looking back on all of that, and you've seen this industry from so many different perspectives, you've also been in my shoes as an independent, provider of solutions. What advice would you give me, looking back at, like, maybe even advice to yourself as a younger professional in the space of being that solution provider or service provider to companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love the lens too of like my earlier version of myself. Because I think the one thing when I was in consulting that didn't really sink in until I think I left and I had different experiences was when you're trying to sell a product or a service, it's not about you, right? It's about your customer. It's about the person that you're selling to. And what you're really aiming to do is help them with a need, right? They have a need, you have a solution. And so it's more of a partnership than anything. And I think I really struggled with, carrying a quota and having, kind of numbers to meet when I was at the firm, because I felt like, I don't know if I'm a salesperson. I don't know if that's me.
We got some salespeople in the room,
I don't know if that's my identity. And nothing. And I think honestly at the time it was because I didn't truly understand what sales was about.
Yeah,
right.
I can relate to this.
I had this archetype in my head of a salesperson,
Yeah.
and what the firm did expose me to, right, was truly really skilled sales individuals, right? Folks that can understand a need deeply in somebody that they're talking to, speak to that need and help serve that customer in a way. And so, the advice I give to myself or you is like, it's a relationship business. It's not about you or your products or your services. It's really about the relationships that you're forming.
Yeah, it is such great advice, and it's something I've thought a lot about. And I look back at all the successes and clients we have, they all come from relationships that there was no like transactional intent behind, or nothing was forced. It was all just stuff that just happened. Sometimes feels like luck, but it's not really luck, right? It's like being in the right place, putting yourself in that place, but then also, like you say, taking the time to truly understand the need. Yeah. You lead a team now.
I do.
Right. What's it like being a leader when you're also considered an expert and people see you as an expert on leadership development?
Yeah, it's like so much pressure, right? Because you're supposed
to have it figured out.
And maybe it's self-imposed, it might be self-imposed, but you're right. It's a very meta place to be in. So, you're leading a team and you're leading the leadership development function. In my world at Udemy, I'm also a learning leader at a learning company on a learning team.
So meta.
So it's very meta. My whole world is very meta. I think it's a little bit of pressure, right? Because I think folks look to you and say, well, you should know this stuff, right? So how are you leading your team? And I just try and show up every day with like almost like a tabula rasa mentality, right? That,
I love that.
I don't think I'm ever going to be the expert, right? I've had a lot of experiences across my career. I'm going to have many more. And same with learning, right? There's always going to be something to learn. And so I try and approach it with a lot of humility and, a lot of willingness to say like, man, I really screwed that up. I really didn't, that's not what I intended, or that's not what I needed to do. And just try and always be self-examining myself to make sure that I'm living up to what I would hope my clients or my customers are, the folks that I work with.
Yeah. That's what leadership is though, right? Like leadership isn't the shining speeches that inspire people. Like that's a tiny sliver of it. Like real leadership is that behavior of saying, I don't have it all figured out, but being okay with failure and learning those lessons from it and sharing that with people so that they can also not see failure as something that's like something that they should be ashamed of or embarrassed by or something to avoid as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a really great mentor once that told me that one of the wisest things you can do is really understand the bounds of your ignorance, because once you understand the bounds of your ignorance, you can work to expand those bounds and continually expand those bounds. And so I feel like I'm doing that a lot in my role too, is saying like, what do I think I understand? And then what don't I understand? And then, investing my energy and really continuing to, be intentionally curious, right? And expand those boundaries where in spaces that are going to be meaningful to my work and meaningful to my company.
Yeah. I'm curious if you see a problem similar to this one that I'm seeing, and I'll describe it, of leaders who have reached a point in their careers, and so I don't want to necessarily typecast as just kind of veteran leaders. I think anybody can have this mindset, but of like thinking like I've figured out, actually my 4-year-old has this mindset as well. So this is definitely not unique just to older people, but like I've figured it all out, right? I know what I know, like I've been successful, I've done all these things. So there's nothing that I don't know already, you know? And to me, it's actually like what you don't know is more important than what you know, and right, as a mindset. Do you see that a similar sort of pattern play out in some cases?
I think so too. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all encountered people throughout our careers that show up with that mindset, right? Of, you know, like I've done this. You know, I've even worked with leaders before that have said like, I'm kind of good, you know, like I'm done growing. Like I don't really want to grow too much anymore. And I think we all go through phases in our life too when we have to think about like when is growth really going to accelerate us? And there's going to be times in our life too where growth is slower, right? Or slower in a sense of like you're not out there acquiring all these new skills, but you're maybe taking a little bit of a pause, you know, and just happy with where you're at. And I think we also don't want to underestimate the value of those folks in an organization, right? Because if they're truly a great leader and they're saying, you know what, I'm kind of good, I like where I'm at, I love my team, I just want to keep doing what I'm doing, those are your steady performers that you want to keep, right? You want to keep them, you know, in role, happy, engaged, you know, producing great talent. And then, you know, there's going to be others that you run into that don't want to learn things and they have to. And, you know, that's just their choice. At the end of the day, you have to understand that you can try and influence them, but ultimately it's out of your control. You know, so you can't worry too much about those things, I think.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a great answer. And it makes me think of also, I don't know if I should do this question now or might as well. The idea of enabling people to lead through change, and that as a skill that can be learned, which it sort of reminded me of when you said how some people want to just kind of stay where they are, but then others who see change and kind of object to it as like this thing that has been done to me, and then there's almost like a victim mentality and stuff as well. That certainly seems to be something that we hear a lot of at companies, and every company is experiencing some kind of turmoil in some shape or form, right? How are you thinking through that as like a way to, again, enable and equip people to go through that?
At Udemy this year, that it's one of our 3 priority skills is being able to, you know, focus on change leadership or lead through change. Because we see the same thing, right? It's such a critical skill to have. I'm almost a little surprised that we're still talking about change as a constant. I feel like I was talking about this like 10 or 15 years ago, and we're still talking about change being a constant. You know, personally, I expect change, right? Like and quite frankly, I kind of like change. You know, it keeps things interesting. Life doesn't get boring if there's a lot of change going on. I also think that we have to think about it from an evolutionary perspective, is, you know, that reaction to change of like, reject it, I don't like it, I'm a victim to it. It was pretty helpful in helping us survive as humans, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, like it's a very normal, and it served us well, instinctual, served us well at one point in time. You know, the world of work, it doesn't serve us well, right? So I think you also have to look inward and say, you know, where are my reactions serving me? Where are they not? What behaviors do I need to let go of? And which behaviors do I need to, you know, adopt in the future? The other thing that I personally as a leader try and remind my team of during times of change too is I try and recenter them in their agency. You know, they have agency in situations. They have the choice to act. And if they don't like a situation that they're in, or that the direction that the company is going in, I'm always going to be the leader that gently reminds them of their agency. Because I never want to retain talent or hold on to talent if they don't want to be held on to. You know, if they don't want to stay, I'm not going to make you stay. And I'm a big believer in agency. I really truly believe that sometimes folks forget the amount of agency that they have, and they just need to be reminded of it.
I totally agree. It's actually a big part of our work, and I didn't think we would go into this, but I'd love to kind of get your perspective on agency a little bit more. Like what does it mean to you? And then maybe as a follow-up, what are some of the initiatives you're trying to do to boost it as a mindset?
Yeah, great question. Gosh, I think I could talk about agency for a while, but I'll keep it short.
We could have started with that.
So, what is so interesting to me about agency is like where, and I'm talking from a U.S. mindset, right? I grew up in the U.S. I went to U.S. public schools, but as my experience moving through like public schools into university, into graduate school settings, you don't have a ton of agency, right? Like you're kind of told what to do, and here's the rules that you have to follow in order to get the A, or move on.
It's all laid out for you.
It's all laid out for you, right? And I think sometimes part of going to college, right, is it's an awakening in agency, because all of a sudden you realize if I don't go to class, no one's going to yell at me, no one's going to, tell me I have to be there at 8:15.
Right.
So it's a bit of an awakening in agency, right? So, I think that in some ways we're kind of shaped to not recognize our agency, and then all of a sudden we discover it and we're not quite sure what to do with it. So I think a lot of like coming up as an adult is about figuring out, how do I move through life? What are the choices that I'm making? And then how am I being accountable for those choices that I've made? Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to do, right? Like there's a reason a lot of people avoid that thinking about that, right? Because it's like, shit, now I have to make decisions, right?
Right. Like, and I'm accountable for those decisions? What?
Yeah. So maybe like go back to the question on initiatives. Like, how are you? That's one of the challenges we've just identified there. Like, how are you trying to actually promote this?
I focus a lot on learner choice in my designs. And so oftentimes when we're thinking about leadership development, where in my own experience, what I've seen is that leaders don't love being told, here are the 3 things you need to learn in the order that you need to learn them in. Because sometimes that doesn't resonate with everyone, right? You're designing for the masses. It's not a personalized experience.
Totally.
And so one of the things I'm always trying to focus on is how can I infuse as much choice as possible in these programs? And so some of the work that the team and I did this past year was designing a skills-based assessment for our leadership development program that folks took at the beginning of the assessment. And the sole purpose of it was to help them choose where to focus their development. And then we had this kind of choose your own adventure where they got to pick, out of the 3 skills, what do you want to start with first? And we heard a lot of stories from folks that took it and said, I went into this thinking that I wanted to work on decision making, but when I took the skills assessment, I actually realized that I needed to focus more on delegation because my knowledge there was not as strong as I wanted to be. So they got some sort of feedback, right, that helped them become more self-aware, and then they were able to choose their development journey. And what we saw is that people who really embraced that and really applied themselves in that way, they were more engaged, right, because it felt meaningful to them. It was something that they wanted, they chose, right? They chose their path, and it's meaningful, right, because it's something they needed to develop.
And it's such a simple thing we're talking about here.
So simple. Yeah.
You mentioned assessments a few times, and it's something that you're really well versed in and spend a lot of time building out. How very clear. I was going to say how important are they? They're clearly very important. What role, if you had to describe like the role assessments can play, and because I think they've also been overdone and kind of misused. How have you seen it used well?
Yeah, so for me, I love assessments when they're used in a developmental context. And, of course, you can use assessments for evaluative purposes too, but I really feel like, assessments that help you hold up the mirror and gain an understanding of yourself. And how am I showing up, or how well do I know this skill? Those are the things that you can then use to inform your approach, right? So I talked about that idea of the bounds of your ignorance. They help illuminate that, right? Because sometimes it's hard to know what you don't know, and assessments can be an instrument.
Just shines a light in that corner of the room, and you're like, oh, that's the thing, right? Right, exactly.
Some of the work that I did earlier in my career was around schemas or our mental models. And I think another way assessments can help is you might have defined influence in your brain one way, and it helps expand your definition of that, of that skill area. And that's another way I think to expand your knowledge is by deepening your mental model, building it out further and further.
Yeah, a lot of what you talk about seems to be around this theme of like getting outside those boundaries or the realm of what you know, and kind of getting into and exploring what you don't know, right? As like, do you make that? Do you have programs, and is that like an intentional part of built into the design of your programs?
Yeah, we try and do that, and I would say as a company we try and do that too. The brilliant thing about being in learning and in tech is that it's quite experimental, right? You're trying to push the boundaries. You're trying to get into that new frontier that folks aren't in yet. So even with like the emergence of Gen AI, in November of 2022, we were the first platform in the world to have a course on it almost 3 weeks later, right? Pretty like rapid. We were at the forefront, and because we were, had access to all of these instructors and the courses, the wonderful courses that they make, we were able to start that learning journey super early on. And what that led to was a lot of experimentation, right? So how can we be using it as a team, as an organization, as individuals? And we started to think on all three of those levels, and try and just intentionally figure it out together, right? And learn together.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way to do it. Everyone's going at the same pace and in the same direction. That's probably more importantly. Yeah. Okay, that was a great little segue into AI. You are, like, I think internally considered the queen of Gen AI.
My boss will call me the queen of Gen AI. Because I bring it up all the time. But I have to say, like, I'm surrounded by a team that is very pro AI. So we're constantly talking about how we're using it or experimenting with it together. So I would say I'm a queen amongst kings and queens of AI.
It's a great place to be. Learning about it. And you push the use of AI in learning in L&D in some interesting ways. You've shared a couple of them with me. Maybe we can just talk through some examples for folks listening. Let's talk about assessments. So we've been talking about that. You say you use them to create pre and post assessments. What does that process look like? Yeah,
I think it's one way that's really going to change the game for assessments too, because a lot of times assessments are cost prohibitive for organizations and they're time intensive. So in kind of the old world before AI, you usually had to partner with a vendor, or you had to have somebody on your team that's skilled at making assessments. And it takes time and money to make them, to write items, to talk to your subject matter experts and get them to write items, and it's a whole thing, right? But with Gen AI, what we were able to do was, look at the courses that we were including into the learning path that mapped to the skills that we wanted folks to learn, and then we asked ChatGPT to write items based on those transcripts. So when you have an asset like a transcript from a course, you can very easily then, ask Gen AI to write an item off of it, right? So we were able to upload kind of all of the, courses that we were teaching or material that we had, and then ask it to write questions. And of course, we look at AI as a partner. So, you're not going to take that and then that's your assessment. You need to do, some back and forth with it, just like you would a teammate or an intern. And so we did that with Gen AI last year as an experiment to see, like, could we create an assessment and save, a couple $1,000 by partnering with a vendor? And it worked great, and for us, it was a developmental assessment. So we didn't have to worry about, all the things you do with more evaluative assessments. But so far it's been working great in the program, and we're planning this year to, kind of redo it, redesign it with some fresh skills, and enhance the prompt that we used.
Yeah, that's awesome. Have you been, do you share that prompt, or is it?
I mean, we could, we could share it. We just, we wrote it internally, and, but speaking of sharing prompts, I think that's, I see us going in that direction too, of this more open source prompt sharing. One person that I deeply respect and follow in the AI world is Ethan Mollick, who's professor at Wharton. And on his website, he has an open prompt library. And so you can go on there and find tons of prompts there too as well. and some of them are quite good. They're really pushing this boundary of having AI kind of spit out an output towards this world where AI is seen as a teammate, right? Almost as a facilitator of experiences. That world is really interesting to me, especially coming from a learning and development lens.
That kind of makes me think of the other example. I think we talked about facilitating after action reviews.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one that you can find on Ethan Malick's website. Him and his team have written a prompt for having AI be a facilitator of an after action review. So, we do these often internally after projects end, or even sometimes before they end, as kind of an earlier step, a check-in.
Yeah.
And it's always falls on a teammate, right, to lead and to facilitate it. So I was very intrigued by the idea of being able to take our team and put us all into the seat of participating in the after action review and having AI actually lead it. So we have it's happening, I think, in the next week or two. So we're going to use it in that way for the first time. So
awesome.
Excited to do that.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear from you how that went. I'm gonna go check out that one because you lose that person if you're not.
You lose that person.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so now I've got like a hypothetical question. You've got a limited learning budget. You've got limited time, right?
Okay.
Reality, and you have to choose between focusing as a priority, enabling leaders to lead through change, or retaining top talent.
Yeah, I'm going to equip them to lead through change, like hands down.
Yeah.
And why I answer in that way is I was actually just at a session this morning, and they shared this statistic that said by the age of 38, folks have had at least 10 jobs. So I think the idea of retaining top talent, it's kind of an old idea, right?
Yeah, right.
Like in this world of work, movement between jobs is actually quite normal.
It's a given, yeah.
It's a given. So I would rather, equip people to lead through change effectively. And from a retaining talent perspective, I'm completely okay if folks want to leave. I find it to be such a great honor when people boomerang back to a company because they've had a great experience there. Or I want folks to leave the company and say, wow, Udemy was such a great learning experience. Like I learned these skills there. These are the experiences that I have had there. This is how I grew as a person there. I think there's like no higher compliment to a company than to say like, my experience was really great. I learned so many things, and like I would highly recommend them as a place to work.
Yeah, it's like it's starting to think of people as ambassadors when they leave, right? And not putting any friction or barriers in place if they want to leave, right?
Exactly. If they want to leave, and if they want to leave and go get new experiences, like that's great for them, you know, and that's a wonderful thing that as a leader, I believe you should be encouraging your team to constantly be thinking outside the four walls of your organization in many ways. And, I think I just have this inherent trust that, folks will come back when they're ready, or they'll refer other really great talent, right, to the organization.
Yeah, exactly.
And I've benefited from those referrals in the past, and it makes a world of difference.
That's awesome. What's next for Rebecca, and in your career, and maybe what you see is next in whatever projects you're working on, and what value do you want to embody as you embark on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's next for me? So I've been loving the world at Udemy. So I'm very, very excited about where we're going in the future. We're starting to, like I was sharing, experiment a lot with AI and figuring out how do we build this into learning experiences? What does it mean for the world of talent development, the world of learning? So I'm very curious and excited to just continue to experiment down that path. I feel like I'm still pretty early on in the vendor space, so I want to get some experience there for a while. And then in terms of what value I'm gonna embody as I walk down that path, I'm gonna keep leaning into being intentionally curious, and really just trying to learn as much as I can about new worlds or new skills that are popping up, and think about as we kind of lead into the future. Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah,
I love meeting and having conversations with people with that kind of an approach to life. So thanks so much for coming on the show and joining us.
Yeah,
today.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Hello, I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listened. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.